Okay.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is...
Joan Hawkins. Were
And
you able to hear?
sorry, go ahead.
I was worried about the volume. Joan Hawkins. I'm a professor of cinema and media studies at Indiana University in the States.
And it's a real privilege to have you here. I wanted to ask about your earrings, Prof.
Oh, yes.
Now, they're different on one side from the other.
Yes.
We
I
have this
bought
in
them
common.
yes, I bought them as a pair, and I bought them at the is it the art it's the art gallery in Ontario, Canada. And that's in the gift store there. And that's where I bought them.
They're fantastic. And one is sort of rectangular and the other more circular. Is that right?
Yeah, it also has a little like tooth. And this
Oh, yeah.
and
Okay.
this one it's hard to see, I think, but it has actually a little like clock face on.
Oh, lovely. The clock and the tooth.
Yes. That could be the title of the the
I,
episode.
I like it. I like it. So, Prof, I wanted to begin, if I may, by asking you a question I ask everybody. Um, I actually just asked the president of PETA this a couple of hours ago. No, I didn't ask her that because I was only given half an hour's audience with her Madge, so
Oh, oh.
it had to be shorter. But what I wondered is if you would share with us, please, what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, impeding, interesting you? What's going on for Prof. Joan?
Well, two big things. I don't know how much your audience is aware of the fact that there have been in a number of states in the United States, there have been very prohibitive laws passed recently, largely in response to student protests against the war in Gaza. And as a result of that, like at our campus, um, rules regarding freedom of speech have been changed. And this year, for the first time ever, I began teaching at IU in 1993. And for the first time ever, I was asked to actively state in my syllabus that, this is a course about film studies, but because directors are impacted by the historical era in which they live and the cultural and sociopolitical events surrounding them, I may mention history. And God forbid, I may mention race. So I actually had to have like this paragraph in my syllabus just to warn them that we might go seemingly off task, but that I knew what I was doing. So I guess that would fall in line with both the dynamizing and the impeding, because I really feel like impeding what I'm able to do in the classroom. But it's also very dynamizing because some of my students and my colleagues have been arrested, and some of them were told because they participated in a demonstration last spring, they've been banned from being on campus. So they're having to teach their classes. They can't physically be on campus. So they're having to teach their courses on Zoom. There's a young man who's a graduate student who I don't know who decided that he was the quote unquote ringleader of all of this, but he's been banned from campus for 5 years. So I don't even know how in the world he's going to complete his degree or his studies. So this nonsense is part of what's both dynamizing and impeding me, because it makes me very angry on the one hand, and it also really affects the way that I do my job. Similarly, on the other side, I'm currently working on two anthologies on 1968. One of them is a volume that is about geopolitics and its effect on aesthetics, kind of writ large. And I turned that into the publisher. And then the second is just about film and media in 1968. And as I wrote in the introduction, I mean, when I first began, I've been working on this for a very, very, very long time.
And you've published on that theme actually in the past.
Yeah. And when I first began working on it, I mean, there were things in the air, but I did not have quite the same sense that I've had now. I mean, truly, as I was turning in my manuscript, I ended my introduction saying that the reason why I think it's important to publish this book now is because everything that we did manage to achieve in 68 is being systematically undone. The progress that was made in education, the progress that was made in health, particularly in mental health, the progress that was made. My argument, I think, largely in the geopolitical book was that the geopolitical things that we tried to do largely, unfortunately, failed. You know, so de Gaulle was out, but then Pompidou was in, you know, so it became like de Gaulle light. The same thing happened to us. You know, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and who did we get? We got, you know, we got Richard Nixon.
Who, by the way, for me was a kind of figure of the most evil order. And I now look on nostalgically.
I'm in exactly the same place. I mean, I truly remember when I thought he was the Antichrist.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know that if he was elected, everything would go to hell in a hay basket. Now I think of him as just this kind of old, pathetic.
He left office on my 16th birthday, and I remember watching his resignation and departure and that slightly sad alcoholic wave outside the helicopter of the president and thinking, well, that's it. Now everything's all right. Everything's going to be fine. And I think, you know, he was in favor of universal health care, a basic wage. I mean, you know, Keynesianism, all these things that the country desperately needs. But anyway, sorry. Yes, we didn't get Bobby. We got someone who was a crook.
Yes. And so working on this book and kind of continually being plunged into the idealism of 1968 and the attempt, on every count, I mean, there was certainly a political and cultural idealism at work, but it was, I think, really the last great romantic movement. And then, but then also the kind of ways in which there was, seemed to be a close interconnection between what was happening politically and what was happening in the art world. And the fact that, you know, that Godard was creating a new cinematic language, and that for us was of a piece with trying to change the way people related to each other, which was of a piece with how the government would work and how these cultural and social systems would work. So that's what it's, and that's
well, I think that the big thing about 68 for me is that when people say it was a failure, I tend to come back at that in a way that supports your earlier remark. I think of the German socialist rallying cry of the late 19th century, the long march of the institutions. When you mentioned education, the other one I thought of was libraries.
Yes.
That these are really areas where progressive ideas took hold.
Yes.
Later on, a little bit about feminism and about environmentalism. And these bastards are trying to undo all of that.
I know. As one of the comedians here said, who would have thought that we would be living through an era where librarians would be, you know, carrying the vanguard, would be at the vanguard.
I know. These are the women in the Raymond Chandler novels and films who, when they take off their glasses and put their hair down, suddenly become sexy, right? But getting to your earlier point, Prof, about free speech.
Yes.
I guess the thing that really terrifies me is that I've done a few of these podcasts with young faculty in certain states, I won't say which ones, who asked me not to ask them anything about free speech, about abortion, about politics, or about race. And one who in the end, we took a collective decision just to gossip, not to record. I mean, we're gossip, you know, I like gossip, we're gossiping, that's fine. But to gossip without recording, because her job was actually owed to questions of racial difference, depended on them, and hence was liable to being destroyed.
Yeah, it's horrifying. I was recovering from a rather bad accident over the summer, and so some students who were in town came to my house to see me instead of me going to meet them at for dinner or something. But at any rate, while they were there at my house, while we were sitting there having tea, this woman, her phone went off and she looked and she said, "Oh my God, they've just eliminated." And it was the Office of Diversity and the Women's Studies program at the college that she taught at. And these were both programs that she was very affiliated with and that she felt made her life at the university rather pleasurable and enjoyable. And she's, sitting there looking at her croissant on her plate and thinking, what am I going back to?
It is really sad. And it is also interesting in the context of these being the people who told us, in inverted commas, that leftist speech codes about gender and race and sexuality were infringing their fucking free speech rights. Guess what? Paper-thin commitment there too, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, and all this stuff here about how you're not, the way that this term critical race theory has been misinterpreted and misapplied. And so that now what they're saying is we can't teach anything about race. We're not supposed to bring it up unless the class is specifically about that, in which case we need to have had our syllabus vetted by whom, they don't say, but by somebody. There's actually, in the state of Indiana, there's actually this commission that reserves for itself the right to vet somebody's syllabus. These people don't know. I mean, what do they know about film theory? These people, I mean, nothing, zip.
I mean, and the interesting thing is, once upon a time, this might have meant an exodus from public schools to Ivies, from big, famous public institutions like yours at Indiana or Michigan or Texas or whatever.
Right.
Now, they're not safe at the Ivies either.
No. The president of Harvard was called up before the Senate in order to defend Harvard University's, what have you done to discipline faculty who dared to speak out against Gaza?
And so this is a very demoralizing moment, but in another sense, an energizing one. As you say, it is both dynamizing and impeding you. You're having your rights to faculty autonomy and pedagogic control infringed, but we do have an extraordinary sensation amongst young people that they must seize the time.
Yes, absolutely. And I know that in the States, I mean, one of the questions that comes up periodically is, well, why are American students so concerned about Gaza? And of course, it's because the United States is funding that war. If the United States told Israel, we're not going to support you anymore, it would stop. It would have to stop, or somebody else would have to step in and take our place. But
it's interesting to me, there is this hysterical response here in Spain. There are two kinds of private universities, There's the Jesuit one and there's the Opus Dei one.
Yes.
And they've been pretty hopeless. Especially Opus. And Opus, by the way, is trying to take over public education.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes. The public universities have basically seen encampments per the US, and the administration, even though it is now in the process of being taken over by Opus, has basically said, okay, let's talk. You can stay there. You can camp outside the rector's office for months at a time. We're going to form a commission, and you're going to be members of it, or your representatives are, to talk about our investments in Israel.
That's fantastic.
Very simple. I mean, obviously it's different in terms of the importance of the Israeli / and Jewish contribution to US life and vice versa, right? Than is the case here. But still, there are ways of negotiating if you're a hegemon. And one of them is to say, let's talk, not shut up and bugger off.
Yes. But unfortunately, it also relies on not having, as we've had here, I mean, we've had actual, like again, the state legislature of Indiana has passed a law saying that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. And so anything that you say that can be construed as anti-Zionist then constitutes hate speech because it becomes anti-Semitic. And so once you have something like that, you can't, of course, you can't negotiate about investments in Israel because you're not allowed to talk about Israel in a
Right.
normal
Well,
way.
and no doubt these are largely Protestant Christian legislatures that don't even want Jewish people at the end of the street.
No, exactly. It's not as though these people are exactly embracing their Jewish brothers and sisters because they are not.
Well,
But I've taken us far afield, I'm afraid.
so 68 becomes a point of departure and of hope. And if I can refer to a brief discussion we had prior to recording, you mentioned that when at the University of Indiana you were hosting a big event on 68, one of your invitees two of your invitees were very important figures in film studies, in cultural studies around the world, but especially in the US, Julia Lesage and Chuck Kleinhans. And you found out that Chuck had passed away.
Yes.
You co-authored a very moving tribute to Chuck.
Yes.
And I wondered if you would mind talking a wee bit about the place that you saw him occupying in that post-68 domain in film studies, but in progressive politics too.
Yes, he was just a phenomenal figure. I mean, he did so much to well, first of all, to allow us to talk about sex in a kind of very open, direct way. And suddenly we were able to talk about queer studies. We were able to just talk about sex and to talk about films that have, sex scenes in them without having to find all kinds of bizarre euphemisms. And, I mean, he was wonderful about that. But he also was, he was a champion for, he came to Indiana University at one point with a short film called The Cry of Jazz, which was an important African-American film that had largely been forgotten. And he presented, we showed the film, he gave a talk, and then presided over a symposium that lasted way beyond his contracted time, because there was so much, because people were asking so many questions, and there was such a real discussion going on among the audience members, so the people were turning around in their chairs and talking to the people behind them and not just saying everything to Chuck.
Wow.
And he was moderating it all, and he was in his element. I mean, he was just with that wonderful booming laugh of his. No, I just think he contributed so much, and then of course he did so much work with documentary. He did so much work with sort of anything that he thought had been suppressed, anything that had been not allowed to be discussed. He made it his job to open up a space where it could be discussed. And then, of course, Julia, she's such an important character because she was such one of the first and loudest and brightest voices for second wave feminism. When second wave feminism first became something that we could only talk about in very hushed tones, and there was no women's studies department, not even, let alone a gender studies department. I mean, dear God, we had like little classes here and there, like women, it wasn't even women filmmakers. It was like women in cinema. And so you would have like one or two women filmmakers, and then you would spend the rest of the time talking about librarians and Philip Marlowe movies. But she and Chuck together started Jump Cut, which was such an important magazine. And it was important both in terms of what they covered and what the space that they gave to people, but also the format of the magazine itself, which was phenomenal because when you wrote something for Jump Cut, you submitted your text. But instead of it being the usual, you are allowed 3 still photographs to illustrate your work. They wanted like 12, 15 photographs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there would be this running like text, well, like a almost like a still video essay running alongside your text with the stills that you had submitted, and the captions for each still was supposed to be not just a little line like this is this is when the serpent appears on the train in Old Boy. This was supposed to be like a paragraph long,
All right.
so that if you read it properly, you were getting, it was like Derrida's glass. I mean, it was like you were reading back and forth between these two
Yeah.
running
Yeah.
essays. They were phenomenal, and God love her. I mean, Julia, it was very hard for her when Chuck died, incredibly hard for her when Chuck died, but she has managed to, and she wasn't sure she would be able to continue Jump Cut. She didn't think she would have the emotional stamina to, let alone the help that she would need. But she's managed to pull things together, and so Jump Cut is still coming out. There's, every time I get an email message from her saying, the newest issue is on its way, I just feel like, Julia, you're just phenomenal. She is just still phenomenal.
And I remember Jump Cut when it was gigantic. Do you remember in that format when you could make a tent out of the bloody thing as you unfolded it, right?
It's true. It was this huge newspaper.
It was like the Sunday New York Times. You unfold this thing and it'd be flying over your head, and there'd be, I remember Chris Strayer's essay on personal best, and there'd be someone's crotch landing on your ear, and from a still from that.
Yes, absolutely.
It's really true. A quick question. Do you know whether there was any project to compile Chuck's many great essays into a book?
That I don't know. I know that they finally found a home for his papers, and I'm not going to remember, I won't be able to remember now the university, but they found a home for his papers, but I don't know if they've actually been able to compile all of his essays.
That would be a great thing to do with an intro, perhaps by Julia. Who knows?
Yes.
Prof, switching, and we both managed not to cry.
Yes, which I think is marvelous. It's especially marvelous for me because I tend to be quite contrary to the things I work on. I mean, people are always surprised. I'm very sentimental.
Well, that does lead me into asking, again, a rather personal question. It's about your creative writing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah? And I wanted to ask about that before we go back into your academic writing. A couple of years ago, you produced a book of creative writing that's about your life from being a preteen to being a young woman. And it has a very affecting title and theme, school and suicide. And so would you tell us a little bit about that volume?
Oh, thank you so much for asking about that volume. So a friend of mine, because I do so much work on experimental stuff, a friend of mine asked me as I was writing it if it was experimental. And I said that it was not experimental in the sense of experimental writing within each of the stories, but that it was experimental in the way that I was telling my life story. So the book is called School and Suicide. It's a kind of a memoir piece, memoir of, as you said, from when I was very young till, 9 or 10, until I was in college. And it's, the formatting of it is unusual in that it's just these short stories, these little vignettes. Each one represents like one aspect of my life. And it's not completely told in chronological order. I began with something that happened when I was 16. This may end up being very, very personal. I did a lot of creative writing when I was young. When I met my husband, I also started making decisions about graduate school and raising a family and all of that stuff. And as I turned more and more attention to academic writing, I stopped creative writing. I wasn't writing poetry or stories anymore. When Skip died, and I was really struggling with how I was going to piece my life back together again. Because I met him, I met him when I was 22, and then he died when I was 59. So my entire adult life had been with this man. And to try to figure out what was it like to be single? What was it like? I couldn't even figure out how to eat dinner. Do you sit alone at a table?
Yeah.
And with your knife and your fork and your spoon and your glass of wine, and you sit there and you eat?
And do you go to the trouble of cooking something special and nice for one?
Exactly. And that there's nobody there in the kitchen who is, either can I chop something, or would you help me with this prompt from the crossword puzzle? I mean,
Yeah.
So it was in that moment when I was really struggling that I began thinking. It was almost like unbidden, different memories from my life came back. And as you know, if you've read the book, that my childhood was a difficult one. And which brings us back to kind of an interesting other political thing, which is that if you write about your parents, if you have not had the cheery deery Hallmark kind of childhood where everything is just marvelous, and mom is making cookies, and dad has his projects in the garage, and you're playing with your Barbie dolls. If you don't have that kind of childhood, then you get to write the memoir. You get to write about that is that you turn your parents into monsters, that these people are horrible and I don't forgive them, and they are awful, awful people. And I did not want to write that kind of book. I mean, the stories that I was writing out of a feeling of both the pain that I felt as a kid and also forgiveness of my parents, because I realized what a terrible time that they themselves were having and how hard it was for them, and that I wouldn't be the person I am today if it weren't for them. And so I began writing these stories, and I began reading them aloud, and people responded to them in this people would be crying. People would be crying at my readings, which doesn't sound like the kind of thing you want necessarily to have happen, but it meant to me that I was, in fact, telling the stories that I wanted to tell. And so I put together that volume. I've also published a chapbook of poems, and I did a compact disc called Progress that is it's two pieces that I wrote. One was about actually being in Paris the night that Richard Nixon resigned, and what that was like. And
well, I was in the Hamptons, my dear.
Oh, well, there you go. But what was very odd was that in Paris, as I was going from part of the city to part of the city to part of the city, and hearing these various people talking to me about it, or hearing these various things, there were all of these supposed sightings of ghosts that night. It was the most bizarre thing. People were out at the Bastille and they swore to God they saw the ghost of the Marquis de Sade. There were people who were out at Jim Morrison's. Well,
I played the ghost of the Marquis de Sade. Sorry.
There were people out at Jim Morrison's grave who always thought Jim was rising, but that night in particular, people swore that they heard Ulrika Meinhof's voice coming through the walls at Nanterre. She wasn't even dead yet, but they had turned her into a ghost. I mean, it was just wacky. So I wrote a piece about that. And then a friend of mine who is an experimental jazz musician and collage artist. So I read the piece, and then he takes it and he cuts it up, and he does these various kind of collaging with it. And similarly, there's a long poem that I wrote about being in Prague in 1973. And that was when the Soviet Union still occupied Czechoslovakia and what it was like being a tourist in an occupied country, which was quite phenomenal because I kept, there's no way we talk a lot about, fascism in the United States. We often talk about, this is becoming a fascist state. But having experienced one time in my life what it was like to have soldiers just bust into a pub or something, it's quite a different experience. I think I've gone on much longer than you wanted me to about my creative writing.
No, not at all. I must admit, I didn't know about the poetry or the jazz collaboration. And so I'm really thrilled that you mentioned that. And I appreciate your speaking about your youth and writing and that caesura of love and marriage, and then the return to it as you're looking for a new or an old subjectivity, right? And that's great. Mentioning ghosts gives me a slightly flip entree to your scholarly work.
Yes.
Because you write about things that I can't watch, horror movies, to the point where I was on a dissertation committee once, a series of horror films about Cabrini Green. And
Candyman, the Candyman.
Yes. I was on the dissertation committee and I thought, okay, the defense is at 2:00. I'll get up early in the morning, but when it's light, and I'll watch these fucking things. I won't be frightened. I lasted about half an hour.
Oh my.
All I got was there's a grad student who's going to come to a grisly end.
Yes.
He ran away in horror, so to speak. So when it came to the defense, I was unusually quiet as a committee member, even though I had read the thing.
Yeah.
And even having read the thing in a sense, knowing what was going to happen, I couldn't face what I was watching. So there's a lot about me. Prof, share with us, if you would, your story with horror. And Carol Clover's work is quite important in that, I think.
Oh, yes. I mean, she was my dissertation advisor.
Yes.
And she was one of the, I mean, it's amazing now, but so she was one of the first people after Robin Wood. Robin Wood started writing in a very serious ideological, he was using screen theory. So it was this combination of Marxism and Freud psychoanalysis that he was using to analyze horror. So he was, I guess, for me, the first person that I read who was talking about these films in really a kind of theoretical and scholarly way. But then her book was the one that just
terrific book. Yeah.
And so I became interested in horror. So this actually goes back. I am my father's daughter. I mean, I started watching horror films sitting at his feet when he was watching, movies at night. I was watching film noir with him and westerns and horror films. This little Joan, just imbibing it all. And but those were like the universal horror movies. Those were, not like slasher films.
Yeah.
But they were still, for a little person, they were quite scary. I still remember my reaction to Frankenstein, which was just feeling, first of all, being very frightened, but also being so sympathetic for the monster. I mean, it was just so clear to me that he was like an abused child.
When I was a child in New York, the way in which Central Park tried to pacify its inhabitants was to put on a screening of James Whale's Frankenstein.
Oh, that is fantastic. That is a fantastic story.
This is the early 70s, and they would all go to watch. Everybody.
Wow.
So for an hour and a half, fairly Pacific.
Yeah. I know.
So child abuse. This is something you could see, you could sense, you could identify with. Yeah.
There's that scene in Frankenstein, James Whale's Frankenstein, where the poor creature this is just such a tragic story to begin with. This creature is created, and then as soon as he's created, his maker is horrified and then abandons him, or just locks him in a dungeon initially, and then abandons him. So it's just the worst kind of quintessential child abuse story there is. And there's a scene very early on in the film where the poor creature is in chains. He's chained to a wall. And Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein's assistant, who in this film is called Fritz, has this torch, and he is menacing the creature, not because the creature is even doing anything. It's just because Fritz himself is so abused that this is the only power he has, is to abuse this other creature. And so he is terrifying this creature with the torch.
Fire.
The creature is rattling his chains. And boy, I saw that and I just, I was just sobbing. I just felt like this is an abused child. This is like something I can relate to. And so that was sort of my introduction to horror. And then also the Mario Bava films came on American television in the 1960s. And so I started watching them and got very, very, very enthralled with the Gothic. My relationship with Carol Cover, when I went to graduate school, I was going to write my dissertation on 19th century fiction. That was what I intended to do. I was a comparative literature graduate student. And I'd had some film classes, but not very many. And Carol Cover at that time was still known primarily as a medieval scholar. And so she was working on Icelandic sagas. And she was a woman professor in the comparative literature department. Okay, so I had taken this class on Victorian literature that I loved, and I found that the novels that I loved the most when I took this class were Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and these novels that seemed to me to be a way of talking about, a way that you would be allowed to talk about sex, that the authors themselves were allowed to talk about sex, and that you as a critic could talk about sex, and particularly about female sexuality. So that's kind of where I was at. And that's why I was thinking I was going to be writing my dissertation on. We had a women's caucus in comparative literature. This was back in the days when there was one woman professor in the comparative literature department. And
this was at Berkeley?
Yes. Yeah. And there were very few women graduate students. And so we had a women's caucus just as, like a protective cell, as it were. Like, how do we negotiate these waters? I mean, it was so sexist. There was a moment in my MA exam where one of my professors, he was cleaning his fingernails during my exam to begin with. And in the exam, he said to me, he brought up this old chestnut that the author of The Princesse de Clèves, which was supposedly the first novel written in French. It was supposedly authored by a woman, but there was a rumor that was running around that was actually Montaigne who had written this novel for her. And so he brought this up and he said, you of course have heard that perhaps Montaigne was the real author of The Princesse de Clèves. And he's cleaning his fingernails and he says to me, how does that warm the cockles of your little feminist heart?
See, look, we guys have a really rough time, and I think the fact you tell that story and laugh at it is a sign of exactly what we go through. Okay, so that really is a shocker. I mean, I don't know what. I think your little feminist heart and cockles is the worst bit, but the accusation and the filing of the nails.
I know the whole thing was just
everything. It is a grotesquerie. I remember a complete defense that I was on, which was about women and bodybuilders. And there were, needless to say, 3 guys, including myself, on the committee.
Yes.
And 2 of us were very interested, engaged, had things to say. 1 never spoke, but wore one of those big belts around his stomach that people do when they're lifting heavy things. Yeah. And had a smile on his face the whole time. This was his contribution.
My God. So it was in that milieu. We had this women's caucus, and we would invite uh, the few women faculty that we could find around the humanities to come in and talk to us about their work in progress.
Great,
So,
great.
so this was a semester when a friend of mine was the chair of the Women's Caucus. So this gathering was going to be at her home. And I was calling her to beg off. I said, I've got all this work to do. Carol's a medievalist. I don't do anything with medieval literature. What in the world, no. And she said, you have to come. You have to come. I'm so afraid that people won't come. And this will be a terrible, will be an embarrassment. It'll be a dishonor, da, 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 da. So, okay. So, and I bought a bottle of sherry just for you. So, okay. So I came. Well,
Sherry,
yeah.
that's very Oxbridge. I didn't realize that was also Berkeley. How wonderful. A bottle of sherry just for you. I'd have poured it down the pot plant. But anyway.
But anyway, so I went, and I'm so glad I did because it was there that this woman that I expected was going to be talking about Icelandic sagas said, "Now I know you expect me to be talking about medieval literature, but that's not what I'm working on right now." And she proceeded to start talking about slasher movies, and gave us, in essence, what was to become. Come on in. Gave us, in essence, what was to become her body himself. And so there we were. And I talked to her after her talk. And as soon as I got through talking to her, suddenly I had an advisor, and I had like I had moved on from Dracula to slasher movies. It was quite this. It was like the conversion experience. It was amazing.
And it is interesting because I didn't know about her Icelandic
Yeah,
past. I
yeah,
only encountered her work with that book.
yeah.
I
Well,
think it was pathbreaking.
that book, which is brilliant, when they were going through the final board vote about whether or not to publish that book at Princeton University Press, they were going to turn it down. And then someone on the board said, "Wait a second, is this the Carol Clover who writes about Icelandic sagas?" And they said, "Yes, it is." And they said, "Well, we have to. She's brilliant. If she's writing about this, then it's important, and we have to publish this book." It's never been out of print since it was published. I'm sure they just, they put out a few years ago. They put out the 25th anniversary edition. I'm sure that whoever was saying, "Oh, we can't possibly publish this," is now quietly pretending that he never said those things.
And in terms of your own work on horror,
Yeah.
was that a tough road to plow, just as that history of the publication of her book indicates it was for her?
Well, she paved the way for us. I mean, at the time that I came out, that I was looking for a place to publish cutting edge. Um, Carol had written her book. Linda Williams had published on horror. There was just this kind of, and there were their graduate students who had been publishing these essays and articles. So it was becoming acceptable, an acceptable academic mode of study or object of study, but it was still kind of cool. and so it was kind of the best of both worlds. Like, this is an acceptable academic area, and it's also still hip.
But Cutting Edge was a bit different in that it looks at this in the context of the avant-garde.
Yes, yes.
And not the kind of Last Girl movie.
Right.
Or slasher. I mean, you don't ignore that, but you're interested in the avant-garde. Bring these things together, quite complicated.
Yeah. Well, especially there was a chapter that I wrote on Yoko Ono's rape. That was the hardest chapter for me to write. You were saying how hard it was for you to watch horror films. Horror films, aside from, I've never been able to watch the torture porn films, really. But aside from that subgenre, horror has not been difficult for me to watch because it's fiction. But the film that I found really dreadfully difficult to watch for that book, I originally watched it for my dissertation was Yoko Ono's film Rape.
Mm.
And when I first saw it, I saw it in a small screening room at the Pacific Film Archive. And I was so happy that I was seeing it there and not in a theater because I could not sit still. I mean, I was walking around the screening room the entire time that I was watching that movie. And for people who don't know, John Lennon and Yoko Ono hired a cameraman to pick a woman at random and to follow her. They ended up following her for 3 days. It was a woman who happened not to speak English. And so as they're following her, she initially is trying to understand what they're doing. Who are they? What are they doing? What is thinking? I don't know what she thought initially. But slowly it begins to dawn on her that this isn't just like some kind of weird, oh, let's find a tourist on the streets of London and put it on TV or something. It's not that kind of a thing. And the longer she tries to figure out what it is, the more distraught she becomes. And she finally ends up at the end of the film. She is in her sister's apartment, which is the door to the apartment. It has the old Yale lock, where if you lock it with a key, you're locked inside, and the unlocks the door with the key. And she tries to run around the apartment to get away from him for a while. And at the end of the film, she is huddled in the corner of the kitchen with her knees drawn up and her head down and her arms over her face. And John Lennon's voice comes on the soundtrack saying, John Lennon and Yoko Ono rape. And that's the end of the movie. And it's just, as I wrote in Cutting Edge, it's a remarkable film in a number of ways. One, in that it is so, on the one hand, it speaks so much to a kind of artistic privilege that needs to be called into question. Like, what gives you the right to pick a woman at random on a street and just take over her life for 3 days and terrify her and not tell her what you're doing in the name of an artwork? And I compared it to Andre Breton saying, like, a surrealist act would be to go down into the street and just start shooting. I'm like, well, that's great for you, but what about the people who get shot? So there's that ethical issue and this idea of privilege. And then there's also the fact that at the same time that Rape came out, so when Rape first came out, the questions that were asked of John and Yoko were, did this really happen? I mean, wasn't there a script really involved? And it turned out that that the woman in question was a model. And so didn't she really agree to this on some level? And once they were satisfied that this really was a cinema verite film, then that was like their only concern. And the one question that somebody asked Yoko about ethics, she just said, leave our morals alone. This is a work of art. So at the same time that was coming out and it became sort of, it's okay, so this is a work of art. We watch it. We appreciate it as some kind of a female as the object of the gaze. And this is what happens to you when you're, they talked about it in terms of like, this is what it's like to be a beetle. Well, on some level, you do choose to be a beetle. You're not just walking through the cemetery, the Highgate Cemetery. So at the same time that this was coming out, and it was like okay somehow when it was art to be stalking this woman, there was the rise of women against violence against women in the media in the United States, so that there were movies that were pure fiction that depicted violence against women that caused a huge outcry. There was the film Snuff by Michael and Roberta Findlay. And people who watched it were convinced that a woman had actually been killed in the making of the film. And so they demanded that there be an investigation. And the New York police did open an investigation. They finally found the woman who had been the actress in the film. There was this big TV spectacular with the head of the Brooklyn police talking to her and showing that she was alive. And at that point, when then the scandal and the outrage should have gone away, everything shifted. And it's like, okay, well, good. It's good she's alive. And it's good that women aren't really being killed in the making of these movies. But what do we think about people who watch these movies? And it turned into this other kind of panic cultural panic about what does it mean to watch violent media? What does it mean, especially to watch violent pornography? Um, uh, not only not only should this stuff be shown, but you had people like Robin Morgan who tried to make a direct connection between
Yeah.
watching violent media and actually going out and committing violent acts. Um, so yeah, so I started watching horror films, but I have to say that film, that avant-garde film, that was the hardest film that I
It's the
watched.
hardest one to look at. That ties into a question I wanted to ask you about a co-authored work of yours, which is to do with William S. Burroughs. And my story about Burroughs is that I used to work with a guy who scouted around the world for books of venomous snakes to send to Burroughs, which Burroughs loved. And
That's
this
a
guy I
marvel.
worked with would turn up every now and then at school when we were leaning over to open our little post boxes and disclose a postcard from Burroughs that would periodically arrive with a picture of a snake on the front. And the postcard would read, "Dear X, thank you for the latest installment, Venomous Books of the World. Regards, William S. Burroughs."
That's a marvelous story.
It's not bad, is it? So your book that you co-edited, I think it's co-edited, right? It is quite remarkable in that in some ways it is drawing upon the cut-up ethos
Yes.
of Burroughs. So could you tell us a bit about the cut-up ethos and also the book itself?
Yeah. So the cut-up ethos, which we argue becomes like a major aesthetic movement of the 20th century, like one of the major aesthetic movements in the avant-garde of the 20th century, is different from collage in that it was actually invented by Brian Gysin. And Brian Gysin, he was cutting mats for paintings that he was doing. And so he had put a pad of newspapers on his table in order to so that he wouldn't cut the table when he was using his X-Acto knife. So he's cutting these mats and he's running his X-Acto knife. And as he's doing it, he's plunging at different lengths into the this pile of newspapers. And what he realizes when he takes takes the paintings away and takes everything away and he's just looking at the newspapers is that there's, in this very kind of unconscious, weird way, words from papers at the bottom of the pile had now shifted up to the top of the pile in such a way that they kind of revealed an ideological substrate of what the news of the day was. And so Burroughs found this to be fascinating. And he wondered what other kinds of text you could do it with. And so he, of course, began working with all kinds of texts that then end up in these novels that he wrote that were cut up novels that are truly remarkable. He was a painter. He himself was a painter for a while, and it became also kind of a graphic artist technique. So the book started out, we did a big conference and symposium in honor of Burroughs's 100th birthday at IU. And so we had an exhibit of his artwork. We showed a selection of the films that he was involved with or films about him. We had some musicians whose work were indebted to Burroughs, who came and did musical performances. It was a wonderful series of events. And of course, we had this academic symposium, and we also had a special exhibit of rare books and documents at the Lilly Library, which is our rare book library. So it was just this kind of thing. And so we were going to publish the conference papers. That was the original plan. And the man that I worked with, Alex Vermeer Cohen, was at that time writing a dissertation about Burroughs. And so we're co-editing this book and just initially, like I said, trying to put these papers together in some kind of coherent fashion and getting people to turn conference papers into polished essays. In the meantime, he's gone back to New York. This is at the exact moment when the New York Public Library has unsealed the Burroughs archives. And so these papers and documents and letters and all sorts of things that hadn't been seen before were suddenly now available to scholars to look at. And so, oh, I'm forgetting his name now, Oliver. I can't remember Oliver's last name. Oliver Harris did a marvelous re-editing of Burroughs's trilogy, the Red Cities trilogy, based on the fact that when he was looking at these documents, he was seeing that somehow things had been published out of order, that some of the novels had been put together sort of out of order, and that the books themselves had been published out of order. And so he re-edited them to give us like something closer to the original version of the trilogy. At that same time, Alex is digging through these archives, and he's finding all kinds of things that have never been published, never been shown at all. So we found, pornographic screenplay for the Wild Boys. We found all of these documents pertaining to this kind of, I don't even know what to call it, like this hate obsession relationship that Burroughs had with Henry Luce and with Life magazine. And so there were all of these things that came out. And so what we ended up with was another lovely person, Patty Zimmerman. When Patty Zimmerman saw the book and was writing a letter for me so that I could be promoted, she referred to the book as being something like a museum exhibit because it had all of these different things in it, all of these documents, all of these various things. And so it's ended up being really a wonderful anthology because it has writings by Burroughs. It has writings about just about every aspect, I think, of Burroughs' work and of his self-presentation, his performance. There's a wonderful essay about his voice and the fry in his voice and what that meant to, his recordings and so on. So it was a great project to be involved in. And there was a problem with that book. There was a problem initially getting it published because of Burroughs' private life, that people didn't have any problems with the content of the book, but they had a lot of difficulty with the fact that Burroughs shot his wife. And so there was this, we kept going back and forth and back and forth. Like, I think there was one reader wanted something really explicit in the introduction to the, kind of to the point that this is a horrible human being. This man, this artist whose work we are presenting here, is a horrible human being. He shot his wife, and is an unrepentant drug addict, and we were able to convince our editor that would be kind of beside the point.
Yeah, I think we know that about the old boy.
Yes.
I think when I saw these postcards of venomous reptiles that came into my colleague's letterbox every now and then, everybody knew he was a reprobate. He was an impossible person.
Yes. There was that story that, he was experimenting with all these, along with the visual cut-ups, he was experimenting with all of these kind of audio tape, cutting up of audio tape and running tape recordings backwards and trying to kind of what we would call now sort of, DJ scratching or something, but he was doing, and he was also very much interested in magic with a K, like throwing curses on.
Right.
And it was one poor, the story of this one poor owner of a coffee shop that he used to frequent. And they stopped making I think it was a cheesecake that he particularly liked. And so he left in a huff and he went across the street with his little tape recorder and he started making this, playing this weird audio soundtrack and throwing curses on the coffee shop. It was quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary.
I think it's a wonderful
It's
book.
continuing your line of pastry. That's all I have to say.
Prof, to finish things, I
Yes.
wondered if I could invite you to add anything to what we've covered. And that might mean going over material that we've discussed, but where you want to say something additional, or it might be something entirely new as a means of giving some, if you can think of closure when you're discussing Burroughs. Good luck, right?
Uh,
As you've shown with these remarkable findings in the archives. But as a way of bringing our conversation to an end, are there things you'd like to add?
yeah, so when I'm asked for faculty profiles and things about, what is it that I work on, I say that I work on taste politics. And, I was very influenced by Pierre Bourdieu and the kind of sociology work that he was doing in France. And um, and the work he was doing on taste. And what he discovered was that, even as we were deconstructing everything, race is a construct, gender is a construct, sexual orientation is a construct. Even as we were saying, all of these things are not sort of, they're not like predetermined. We did kind of hang on for an awfully long time to this idea that there was such a thing as good taste. Can't, like pornography, can't define it, but you know it when you see it. And conversely, can't define it, but you know when something's in bad taste and when it's not good taste. And and a lot of trials that had to do with obscenity rested on that impossible distinction, right? Like, is this titillating, or is this actually a work of art? Which really kind of always came down to, is this in bad taste, or is there something redeemable about it? Is it in good taste? Um, and what Bourdieu found out was that, of course, this is not like written in stone up on Mount Sinai someplace. That in fact, I mean, he did this really remarkable study. So in France, people really are taught cultural, they are taught to appreciate culture in a way that we are not in the States. So little French school children go to museums and they sit, and whatever age group they're in, they do some appropriate activity with the paintings that they're seeing in the Louvre or in the Jeu de Paume or wherever. What he did, so he was not surprised that when he would talk to people, the names that they would recognize, like, would you recognize Renoir, the name of the artist Renoir? Would you recognize the name of Debussy? Or would you, whose names would you recognize? He was not at all surprised that they would recognize, that the more education you had, the more likely you were to recognize and express appreciation for famous painters or musicians, classical musicians, famous painters, dancers, etc. But what did surprise him is that when he talked to people about things that weren't part of the curriculum at all, jazz music, film directors, that the same discrepancy held true. So the same people who could tell you that Renoir was a wonderful painter could also talk to you about Miles Davis, and could also talk to you about Antonioni or Godard, even though those things were not, the content was not taught in school. And so he began to get this idea that there actually was a way in which schools, without perhaps meaning to, without it being on the curriculum, they were actually teaching taste. What do you consider to be good? What do you consider to be bad? What do you like? And so when I began working on horror and the avant-garde, I mean, one of the things that, as I said in my earlier example with John Lennon and Yoko Ono's film Rave, in many ways that's a stalker movie. If it was made by people who were not famous, it would be a horror. It could be a horror movie, especially if it had a more violent ending than the one it had. But it's art because of the people who did it, and you read it differently for those reasons. But the line that divides what generally is considered to be low culture and high culture is really much more like a permeable membrane. Things go in and out. There are shots in horror films that are exquisitely, exquisitely beautiful. that are left in for no reason having to do with the plot. You just know when you watch them. There's a shot in Night of the Living Dead where Barbara, this young woman who becomes catatonic very early in the film, but she's in the farmhouse with the zombies coming in from outside, and she comes across this little diorama with little pieces of glass mirror on them. And she turns it on, and it's a music box, and it goes around and around, and the light refracts off her face, and it's just beautiful. And it does nothing for the film. You just know that Romero looked at it and couldn't bear to throw it away because it was so lovely. And so there it is in the middle of this zombie film, this moment of pure aesthetic beauty. Um, so so I do a lot of work on taste politics about how this thing that we consider to be a given is actually it's actually taught to us, and what we're taught to consider good taste is almost the least interesting aspect of art. It's bourgeois middle class stuff. So if you talk to people who consider themselves to be, kind of people who watch PBS or who say take out a subscription to the New York Ballet, they will be equally put off by extremely avant-garde work. They will be as put off by that and disdainful of them as they will be of slasher films. And I would argue there's a reason for that. It's because both things fall on the extreme of the cultural divide.
That's so interesting. So, Prof, it's been wonderful talking to you. I really admire the breadth and depth of your work. I really appreciate the way in which you've shared a lot of yourself in terms of loss, identity, recovery, commitment, and so on. And I thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you so much. I'm a great admirer of your work too, and I was so pleased when you reached out to me.